Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. This was one of my first tutorial videos and I decided to make a shorter version for YouTube. This was watercolor painting that I did and the reference photo that we used for the chili. I used most of my cooler reds for this chili. There are lots of detail on this chili. I took my time adding layers, adjusting colors where I needed throughout the whole painting process. For the darker values, I used ultramarine mixed with red, created a beautiful dark value of purple. I would have used a little drop of paint grey if I didn't have any ultramarine. For the darker values, I used this very dark purple mix. After the first initial wash, I went in with the darker colors. I used Windsor Red, a little bit of French Vermilion, and a few other reds that I had in my paint box and on my palette. So again, use whatever you have and make this painting your own. You can make this a warmer chili with warmer reds, so by adding a little bit of yellow or orange in with your colors, you will just make it a little bit more warmer. So I started with all the darker values on my painting, and as you can see, there are loads of detail on this chili. One thing I did with this painting, I made sure that each layer dried completely before I added the next layer. This way I will not lift any of the color that I already painted on. That will create this beautiful shiny chili on your watercolor paper. I also use Art hot press watercolor paper. So for this painting, if you really want this painting to turn out well, I suggest that you make sure that you use a very good quality watercolor paper. Look at my tonal values and I leave all the highlights as light as possible. I always go back later with a glaze, a very watery glaze all over all the highlighted sections, and I have a tissue in my hand where I just dab it up so that I can create all of those little white sections that you can see on the chili. I really want to keep the highlights as light as possible. The lighter values that I use for that purple blue ultramarine mix is also very watery. The only very dark mix that you can see is on the bottom of the chili, where I used a very dark mix of the Payne's grey and purple ultramarine mix. My first wash on the green section was a little bit of sap green. You can mix your own green. I then went in later with a little bit of my Dr. P.H. Martin sap green watery color mix. For this I used burnt sienna with a drop of Payne's grey. You can also use a little bit of the yellow ochre mix with Payne's grey if you prefer. That's a little brown section that was on the chili that I had to add in there. Now all the fun starts, where I have to go in and create all of those dark value markings or little folds that you can see in the chili. So I take my time and just layer each section and wait for it to dry before I go back. I want all of these little sections to be very dark, where there are those little deeper folds in the chili, and I didn't soften all of the lines. So I just go in on certain parts of the sides of the chili and I soften those little darker lines that I created earlier. For the edges of the chili, I use this purple mix again. That will create this beautiful rounded effect on your chili. I already follow all the detail that I can see on the reference photo so that I can create this beautiful realistic chili. And now I will just go back and forth and layer each layer and go darker and darker until I'm happy with the chili. And sometimes when you notice your paintings just don't look right, they just don't look finished, you can do the following. Take your reference photo and edit it to a black and white photo. Use that to check where you have to darken your values. The darker sections need to be darkened and the lighter sections need to be as light as possible. That is the only way that you will create a beautiful, realistic chili or any watercolor painting. Another tip is to clean your water all the time, because you don't want to dirty your watercolor painting. So stand up and just take a break and quickly clean your water glasses of water. Just by making sure that your water is clean, you will prevent creating any muddy watercolors. After I added the lines with a thick consistency of watercolor paint, I use my big round brush just to soften those hard lines. And I just use my brush very softly over that section because I do not want to remove all of the pigment. I left my watercolor painting to dry completely. You will notice that watercolor paint dry much lighter than your first initial washes that you added on. So when you come back maybe in a few hours just to check on your painting, you'll notice your painting is much lighter and you have to adjust certain tonal values. That is why I never clean my palette the day when I think I'm finished with my painting. Most of the time I have to come back the next day and just adjust certain tonal values and darken certain sections again. If you want to see more videos like this and want to learn more, you can subscribe to my channel and press the bell button. That way it will notify you every time I add more videos. I have a Patreon channel with more in-depth tutorials, and on Patreon I supply a list of the supplies that I used, a reference photo and a line drawing for my students. The tutorials are a little bit longer where I talk you through the whole process step by step. With my style of painting, I prefer to go in with lighter values first, or lighter layers of paint first, and then I adjust it all the time. So there are quite a few layers, and then I make sure I wait between each layer so that the paint dries completely, or my paper dries completely. You can use a hairdryer if you prefer, but that way I make sure that the layers and the paint stay fresh and beautiful. you.